The Titans reportedly have their head coach. With Ramon Foster and Kayla Anderson, I'm Will Bowling. Robert Walsh, our producer. We get the local perspective right now, courtesy of Mo Egger. Afternoons on ESPN 1530, also on 700 WLW and ESPN Radio, giving us the perspective on the new head coach of the Tennessee Titans. What's up, Mo? How are you?
I'm doing great, guys. What's going on?
Boss, good morning.
Man, just a little bit to talk about here in Bengals offensive coordinator Brian Callahan being the Titans' reported pick. What can you tell us about a guy who is very well spoken of by a lot of the best quarterbacks around the league? And from Zach Taylor, for a guy who has not called plays, Mo, it sounds like Brian Callahan has still had a very big role in this Cincinnati offense.
Yeah, no question about it. And I think you start with Joe Burrow's rookie season. You know, it was the weirdness of COVID, and as great as Joe was in college, as terrific a talent as he is, you know, it's not easy to be a rookie quarterback asked to start week one in the NFL. It's even more difficult when you have to learn the offense from your parents' couch in Athens, Ohio. It was the weirdness of that entire offseason, right, where they had to do everything virtually. Training camp was weird. There were no preseason games, and yet I think the coaching staff and Brian Callahan had a big hand in this, did a great job of getting Joe ready to go week one, and he played more than capably in his NFL debut. And so I think of that. I also think of, and Titans fans saw this, the year the Bengals went to the Super Bowl. They got there in spite of a dreadful offensive line. And I don't think the offensive coaching staff got enough or gets enough credit for, on a weekly basis, designing game plans knowing their offensive line was going to be a major deficiency. You guys saw it in the playoff game that year where the Titans sacked Joe Burrow 9 times. It completely neutered their explosiveness. But I think the coaching staff did a good job of designing functional game plans around that bad offensive line. I think that says a lot about Brian Callahan. I also think this past season, look, they had to play a huge chunk of the season with a backup quarterback who had never played in an NFL game, in Jake Browning. And he was more than functional toward the end of the season. I think Brian Callahan's work had a hand in that. So I think you will see. He didn't call plays. But I think if you look at some of their greater offensive successes, I think you'll see Brian Callahan's fingerprints all over the place.
Mo Egger, ESPN 1530 in Cincinnati, our guest. And Mo, Amy Adams-Strunk has been clear in what she wants in a head coach and someone who can collaborate with new general manager Rand Carthon. And that was part of Mike Vrabel's undoing, of course, that's been reported, was his say on personnel control and wanting the final say in a lot of that. In a guy like Brian Callahan, who has been a lot of places and who understands the way the culture was changed in Cincinnati, what has worked in the culture shift in Cincinnati that you feel like Brian Callahan, as just a culture builder, will bring here in his collaborative efforts with Rand Carthon?
Well, the first thing they did is they drafted Joe Burrow.
That helps.
You know, it starts with that. But no, I mean, look, if you look at when this staff took over, remember, Marvin Lewis had been here for 16 years, and there were a lot of holdovers from Marvin's regime over those first couple of seasons. And I think the coaching staff did a very good job of rebuilding the culture here, even though there were some guys who weren't completely on board. And I think, you know, that sort of spreads across the roster. It's been a marked shift, you know, I think just in terms of the Bengals having a bunch of guys who are more committed to playing for each other and with each other than what they had with the previous regime. And a lion's share of that credit is going to go to Zach Taylor, the head coach. I think they've done a very good job of shifting how they pick players and moving away from, you know what, we're going to give a guy a second opportunity, even though he doesn't necessarily other teams don't view him as being necessarily deserving of that opportunity. And I think they're more willing to just sort of say, okay, we're going to take a guy who is maybe not quite as talented, but is going to be a little bit more willing to buy into our system, maybe a little bit better at not getting in trouble off the field, maybe somebody who's a little bit more team-centric. I think the other thing, you know, the Bengals have gotten better, right? And getting better means guys are going to start to get paid. And they've had some guys who have not been, I think, privately thrilled with their contract status, as is the case when you have to pay everybody, including your quarterback. And yet it's never been an issue in terms of disrupting what they're trying to accomplish. You know, they had, and it's on the defensive side of the ball, but they had Jesse Bates go through an ordeal where for 2 years they couldn't get a deal done. He played under the franchise tag. He wasn't happy about it, but in those 2 seasons they won back-to-back AFC North titles. I think this staff as a whole has done a very good job of just keeping everybody focused on what the task at hand is, understanding that from the business perspective, there are going to be some decisions that the front office has to make and that players themselves have to make, but let's not allow those things to creep into what we're trying to accomplish on the field. And again, that starts with Zach Taylor, but I think you're being naive if you don't think the coaching staff by extension has had a major hand in all of that.
We're joined by Mo Egger right now of ESPN 1530 out of Cincinnati. And Mo, I have to ask this question too because it's been said a lot of times that the ability that Brian Callahan has to be fluid from game plan to game plan, from quarter to quarter is something that this offense here in Nashville has been somewhat struggling from first half to second half or one game to the next. How have the players, if you've spoken to them, spoken about his ability to change up what they're doing in game and from week to week?
Well, I'll go back to the end of the season because the offense they were running with Jake Browning was different than the offense they were running with Joe Burrow. You know, Joe doesn't like to be under center. He likes to be in empty backfields. With Jake Browning, they had to shift on the fly, and suddenly they were running things out of, with him under center. They were running, sets. Heck, there were times they even had 2 running backs. It was like watching football in 1987. They have been pretty malleable, if you will, in terms of just being able to adjust to what they have. And again, the primary example that I will give you is, they're the best offensive line the Bengals have had since this regime took over was the one they had this past season. And it still wasn't a good offensive line. It was league average at best. And so I think when you're preparing for an opponent week to week, to know that we are kind of going into a game with one hand tied behind our back because we just don't have a bunch of guys up front who can move people. We don't have an explosive running back in a guy who's maybe a little bit more capable of hitting home run type runs than Joe Mixon is. And yet, they had the number 4 offense in the NFL in 2022. Obviously, the talent they have on the outside with Jamar Chase and with T. Higgins has a lot to do with that. But I think the other thing they've done is they've been able to take parts from other teams and slide them in and get a lot of use out of them. I think the way they used Hayden Hurst as a tight end in 2022 is an example of that. I think the way they created a role for C.J. Uzomah, and he had a season that enabled him to go get paid by the New York Jets in 2021. I think that's an example of that. I think they've been very good at adjusting on the fly, and I think more than anything, they've been really good at figuring out a way to thrive and at the very least function when they've had that deficient offensive line. That, to me, more than anything that this coaching staff has done, and Brian Callahan has been a big part of that, when you've got to figure out how to make your offense work and your quarterback is going to get hit a lot, that's not easy. And yet this staff and this team were able to do that to the point that they made consecutive AFC championship games.
The next question I have for you is about the management of the roster and management of the team and decision-making, right? The 2021 draft was, I think Cincinnati was in a position to where he could have taken Penei Sewell or Jamar Chase, and they elected to choose Jamar Chase, and it was a great decision. But, of course, you mentioned the protection issues that Cincinnati's had over the last few years. His fan base has been they went through a reflection yesterday as it was the 2022 AFC championship game. Well, the divisional round against the Bengals where you guys beat the number 1 overall seed. And Joe Burrow got sacked 9 times, but you guys still won. Moving forward with him at the head coach position, do you see him addressing the O-line first, or do you have a guy who's offensive-minded that want more skilled players like a Jamar Chase instead of protection? Because they need it here in Nashville too.
Sure. Now, I think if you look at what they've done on the offensive line, it's not like they've ignored it, right? I mean, heck, they've signed Alex Kappa and Ted Karras and La'el Collins and Orlando Brown signed a massive deal last year. So I think, look, if you go back to the spring of 2021, they had Joe Burrow and they had T. Higgins, and they had an offensive line they knew needed fixing. But I think the thinking then was, we want to be elite at one position group. And we think if we draft Jamar Chase we will all of a sudden have this group of wide receivers that makes us great on the outside. And Jamar is going to give us explosiveness that automatically is going to sort of make over our offense. And then slowly but surely, we're going to get the offensive line fixed. And look, Penei Sewell has turned out to be a heck of a player. So it's not like, boy, they got it right with Jamar and Penei Sewell was a bum in Detroit. I think it's very reasonable to wonder, what would this offense look like if they bypassed Jamar Chase and took Penei Sewell? But for the purpose of what they were trying to accomplish, it worked. And I think they looked at the offensive line and said, well, we're going to be so good on the outside, and our quarterback is so good at making quick decisions, that in itself is going to keep him upright. Did it work to the degree that they would have liked? Well, no, because he once got sacked 9 times in a playoff game, and he got sacked 7 times in the Super Bowl. But they made the Super Bowl. And if you look at that draft in 2021, they did take a lineman in the second round. Unfortunately, he hasn't really worked out. I would imagine that the offensive team-building philosophy will remain the same, where they go, look, let's be great at this one area as quickly as possible. Maybe that's wide receiver. Maybe it is on the offensive line. But if that's what they did in 2021, they looked at what they had and said, let's be great at one thing. What can it be? What can it be? And with the addition of Jamar Chase, suddenly they had one of the best wide receiver groups in the NFL. And it did work, even if the offensive line build came very, very slowly and at a bit of a cost. Because, again, they're probably Super Bowl champs 2 years ago if they had a reasonably competent offensive line.
Mo Egger of ESPN 1530 in Cincinnati joining us this morning on RK Dub. So, Mo, obviously Brian Callahan has been there 5 years under Zach Taylor. And I feel like a lot of head coaches, at least nowadays, that are offensive coordinators beforehand, leave a little earlier. What was the benefit, really, of him staying here this chunk of time? And what can he now use that in terms of being a head coach and a leader of men in his next spot as a head coach?
Well, I mean, it was pretty remarkable, right? I mean, the Bengals went to the Super Bowl 2 years ago or 3 years ago, I guess. They went to the AFC Championship game. And yet, after all that success, they brought back the same exact coaching staff this past season. And we talked about it a lot going into the year. Like, man, you've got to take advantage of that continuity. And unfortunately for the Bengals this year, they couldn't do that. I think with Brian, first of all, I think for some teams there's just the stigma of, yeah, he's an offensive coordinator, but he doesn't call plays. I think that's sort of outmoded way of looking at things. I also think there's an unwillingness to look beyond the fact, well, they drafted Joe Burrow. And so, suddenly he's going to make everybody out to be smarter than they are. I think, the other thing is, it's not like this was the first time he interviewed for jobs. He interviewed in Denver. He's sort of made the rounds, if you will. I think there's always been a sense of it's a matter of when and not if he becomes a head coach. I've always been sort of interested in wondering, does he end up being a plan B for a team that doesn't get, obviously not a consideration in Nashville, but doesn't get Mike Vrabel or doesn't get Bill Belichick or doesn't get Jim Harbaugh. But, look, this is a guy who's grown up in the game. My understanding is he's going to bring his dad with him to be the offensive line coach, Bill Callahan, the former head coach of the Oakland Raiders. I've certainly read that. He has had, if you go to when this coaching staff took over, they were a punchline. And that first season with Zach Taylor, they were miserable, 2-14. I think Brian Callahan, if he's smart, and I think he is, not only did he have a hand in this franchise, becoming one of the better teams in the NFL, at least for a couple of years, he not only had a hand in it, I'm sure there were lots of things that he could grab from that experience that he could apply to his next job in Nashville.
Mo, the one question I think a lot of people have here is, since this is the first time he's putting together his own coaching staff, how many connections do you feel like? And I feel like he has a lot because of his dad and just because of how long he's been in Cincinnati and he's been in Denver. But for the defensive side of the ball, like how do you feel like he can reach out to some of the people to build his staff on that side?
Well, all I can do is tell you what it was like here, because the defensive coordinator in Cincinnati, Lou Anarumo, was, I think, had he said no, they were going to hire me. He was not very high on the list of candidates, at the outset of the process when the Bengals were putting together a coaching staff. And, I remember when they hired Lou, he was the defensive backs coach of the New York Giants. There was this, real sense of, God, really, him? And it took forever. The Bengals coaching staff that first season, they all had to introduce themselves to each other at the combine. That's how long it took. And so I'm not really sure that what happened here in hiring Lou Anarumo is the blueprint you want to follow. Now, fortunately, it's worked. And he's done a very, very good job with this defense and is somebody that I think deserves head coaching consideration on his own merits. But I don't know that the way the process played out here is what any team really wants to pattern themselves after, because it took a long time. A lot of the initial candidates either turned the job down or they just couldn't come to an agreement as to what employment would look like, or they didn't really mesh philosophically. I don't know that anybody wants to follow that here. That said, it does go to show that sometimes the obvious answers for who should be a defensive coordinator or an offensive coordinator for that matter often aren't the best ones, because nobody knew who Lou Anarumo was, and I happen to think he's one of the best defensive coordinators in the NFL. What they swing for, what they look for, if it's somebody with experience, if it's somebody who's going to be moving up a rung on the coaching ladder to go from a position coach to a defensive coordinator, I don't know. But I would hope for his sake, and I would hope for the sake of the Tennessee Titans, that the defensive coordinator hire and the overall assembly of the coaching staff doesn't take as long there as it did here. I think the other thing you have to remember is when the Bengals made the move from Marvin Lewis to Zach Taylor, it also happened very late because they had to wait for Zach Taylor to coach in the Super Bowl with the Los Angeles Rams. And so that staff, that first season, and they've all talked about it, they were really playing catch-up from day one. I think that was reflected by how the team played that first season. Obviously, that's not so much a consideration with the Titans getting the hire done pretty early in the process.
Good point.
Great stuff from Mo Egger, Cincinnati radio host, afternoons on ESPN 1530. And Mo, on the way out, man, you mentioned the Bill Callahan aspect of this. We know intimately well in Tennessee, sometimes the dark side of the Haslams getting involved in maybe too much in football at the University of Tennessee. Surely they wouldn't block someone going to coach with their son, right?
Well, it is the Haslams, and it is the Cleveland Browns, so I guess you never know. But I would imagine that if there's a way out of that, or if there's a way to get it done, that the Titans and the Callahans have figured out a way. But you're exactly right. If somebody could get in the way, I guess it's Jimmy Haslam.
It would be him. That's right. Great stuff from Mo Egger this morning at Mo Egger, EGGER on Twitter. Mo, thank you so much for the time. A quick turnaround from the news breaking last night. We really appreciate it.
No question. Anytime. You got it.
Thanks,
Absolutely.
Thanks,
There's Mo Egger with us this morning here on RKW. And that note on Bill Callahan, especially interesting on the offensive line coach of the Cleveland Browns, potentially coming to Tennessee. We'll give you that audio if you missed it just a few minutes ago from Mo and his understanding that Brian Callahan intends to bring his dad with him. And that is a big, big positive for the Titans and a bad offensive line this past year. That's next on RKW.